This video is sponsored by Squarespace. 4 rounds into the 2025 Formula 1 season and the McLaren boys find themselves 1-2 in the Drivers' Championship, a commanding lead in the Constructors to boot. Split by just 3 points, Lando Norris leads the way so far, but I've got to say, off the back of Bahrain, it's Oscar Jack Piastri who feels like the man to beat. Much was made of his move from Alpine to McLaren, but finally now we're seeing this young driver with so much potential starting to actually deliver. This kid, I think, is generational. My name's Tommo. Let's talk about it. When you go back to back in Formula 3 and Formula 2, you set quite a precedent, quite a standard. Charles Leclerc did it, George Russell did it, Gabriel Bortoleto has done it as well. And hopefully in time, when he's not in a Sauber towards the back, he'll be able to show his ability. But Oscar did the business, convincing in Formula 2, even Formula Renault before F3, he went back to back to back. His first year at McLaren, I thought was pretty strong. Second year was a decent improvement, but missing out on some consistency for sure. However, he did secure his first win before Lando, technically, in the sprint race. In Qatar, he showed he had those peaks, but the troughs were absolutely there. However, now, 4 rounds plus a sprint race into the season so far this year, you got to say he is looking very, very, very complete. The head-to-head was way in Lando's favour in terms of qualifying last year. However, I do remember, more often than not, that gap would be pretty small, but Lando just always had that little bit of a tenth on Oscar, which, you'd expect a driver of Lando's experience, a driver of Lando's one-lap prowess, because that kid is rapid as well. Going into this season, we were looking for Oscar to be able to just bring that little bit more and put that little bit more pressure on his teammate, because going into the year we thought McLaren were going to be the strongest package, and that is how it has turned out. And you go into this season so far, Oscar's averaging almost 2/10 on Lando in the 5 qualifying sessions we've had so far, which is not insignificant. It does definitely feel like over a lap Oscar's found a way to hook this up. And this isn't all just about, one lap prowess and natural talent. This is about getting the tyres in the right window. Drivers talk about this all the time, working with your pit wall to make sure you're setting up your lap appropriately, correctly, so you have the right temps at the start and can hold on to the tyres at the end. These are things that Oscar needed to work on and need time ultimately to get to, right? Drivers can come in, hit the ground running in terms of talent, but it's all those operations, all those boring things that you also need to get on top of to extract the maximum delta. Even when Lando has been able to out-qualify Oscar so far this season, in Australia it was by less than a tenth, in Japan it was less than half a tenth. So then you think to yourself, right, can he now convert and deliver in the races? Which again, race pace for Oscar at many a time during his F1 career relative to Lando Norris hasn't been there. But it feels like now that isn't a problem anymore. I mean, look at him in Australia. Of course, it all unravelled going off track, following Lando off track. If anything, he was following Lando too closely. If he'd have been a bit further back, he'd have been able to react a bit more to Lando carrying too much speed and going off circuit. Maybe, right. But at the end of the day, he was pushing him the whole way. And without that incident, maybe he could have sized up a move. I don't necessarily think he would have, just because you've got that dry line. It's very hard to make a move off track, but he was absolutely keeping pace with his teammate in Australia, undoubtedly. Then of course in China, he does the business relative to Lando in sprint qualifying by like 4.5 tenths, and in the race converts a pretty comfortable win in the end. And look, Japan, he did make his mistake in sector 1. He almost clawed it back with purple sectors in 2 and 3. And then in the race, you're stuck in dirty air. And Suzuka, wrong tyre compound choice, conditions that allowed everyone to push flat out and do a 1-stop. And again, arguably, Lando was getting caught and Oscar was pressuring him, and maybe Oscar would have been close enough to Max to put a move. I'm not so sure. I think the delta would have been too much, and Max certainly wouldn't have waved Oscar past. It would have been nice to see just from an interesting point of view, but in every Grand Prix so far this season, in race pace, Oscar has been at least as quick as Lando, if not quicker. And then you look at that 2/10 qualifying delta and you're starting to be a bit concerned. Yes, of course, Lando has 3 more points than Oscar so far this year, but he's closed a massive delta since after Australia, where Oscar did get very unlucky. Ultimately, the outcome was super unlucky for what happened. So with 20 more races to go, what isn't he delivering on? This kid's unbelievable. Almost as unbelievable as today's video sponsor, Squarespace. If you do want to build your very own beautiful online home, Squarespace has thousands of glorious drag and drop templates, super easy to use. Whether it's an e-commerce website, a blog, a portfolio. I've had my portfolio on Squarespace since 2018. It's been a hell of a long time, and I sell merch, TOMMO'S Racing Goods, on my store, all powered by Squarespace. Design intelligence, AI powered software makes it an absolute breeze, an absolute doddle. Honestly, give it a go. It's free to try as well. You've got plenty of time to have a play around, have a go with it. And if you don't like it, you don't have to carry on. But when you do, because I'm pretty sure you will do, and you want to put your website live to the world, head to squarespace.com/TomIF1 to get 10% off of your very first website or domain. Because outside of that raw pace, you then look at Oscar's unflappable nature. Okay, he's so measured, he's so assured. He doesn't have those high highs, but he doesn't have those low lows either. Some people might not find that particularly interesting or exciting, but in terms of actually delivering, if you want a golf analogy, think of Scotty Scheffler. Measured, never let it really get to you. And that comes across in his driving, because we don't see Oscar making very many mistakes. There have been times where he's been off the pace, but in terms of actual mistakes, crash happiness, Oscar's a pretty safe pair of hands. And all this in only his third year in Formula One, 24 years of age, with 50 race starts to his name. Old Toro Rosso team principal Franz Tost, the man entrusted with all these juniors in the Red Bull program, who has ultimately, you can say what you want about the Red Bull Junior program, but they've delivered, you know, Verstappen's, Vettel's, Sciences, etc., who have all come through that junior team. And he says, you know, you need to give these young drivers 3 full seasons before you can properly judge them. Oscar's not even done 3 yet. To be this measured, to be this assured, and to have started this season as impressively as he has. Yes, those 2 high-profile mistakes in Australia that was very, very punished, and Suzuka qualifying. But without them 2, damn. Potential is such a dangerous word, and Oscar had so much coming into it. And when McLaren swiped him from Alpine, I mean, Alpine tried to cope and say, oh, we actually have a stronger lineup with Ocon and Gasly now, and we saw how that turned out. Oscar's performed above my expectations in terms of the start of this season. You know, I thought this would come eventually, maybe like mid-season onwards, you know, once he's kind of settled into the rhythm, but he's honestly hit the ground running and looks so comfortable, so at ease amongst all of the drivers around him who have, you know, 3-figure plus race starts. And Lando's got to be concerned. On his day, you cannot doubt Lando Norris's one-lap prowess, unbelievable, and his ability to manage a race in terms of race pace. Anyone genuinely questioning that needs to give their head a wobble. Of course, Lando is incredibly talented, no doubt. However, he's not happy at the minute, is he? The words he was directing at himself over this weekend were very, very negative, and we know Lando can do this. We know that, you know, self-detrimental self-talk is something that he's always had, and he's very open, he's very transparent, and I think a degree of that is important, and just on a human level that's a really great trait to have. But you do have to wonder, is he going so far to put himself down to then manifest that reality? You know, I think a degree of delusion is kind of needed in life, right? Absolute optimism, absolute belief in yourself. Now, Lando's incredibly talented, of course he is, but in that way, it feels like Oscar does have a real advantage over him, because Lando's in a hole right now, and it's not about how you fall, it's how you get back up, okay? Look at Rory, just won the Masters. Golf analogies are plenty here. Do you know I've just started a golf YouTube channel? Brilliant. A consistent theme amongst the greats is that it's never always popping, it's never always on top all of the time, right? That does not happen in any sport at any period. Lando needs to find a way to dig out of this hole, because he was very, very, very negative talk about his comfort in this car right now, where McLaren are pushing the envelope and getting to the absolute top edge of this ground effect regulation in its current state. These cars are going to become inherently more unstable than they were when there was a lot more potential performance to unlock. Those operating windows are going to tighten as you get closer to the top. You can't, unless you've got a Mercedes power unit advantage, I guess, and make a top car with a massive operating window. It's going to have to narrow, and it seems to be tripping up Lando more than it is Oscar right now. Now, is this to do with their driving styles? You know, Lando typically has more of a U, Oscar more of a V. So around certain Grand Prix circuits, I actually thought it would benefit Lando more in Bahrain. Turns out it was the other way around. That's going to test those driving styles in slightly different ways. Kind of like when Lewis and Jenson were McLaren teammates back in the day. Jenson was much more of a U driver, more like Lando. Lewis, more like Oscar, more of a V approach. But all the time, Lando's dogging on himself and getting down and putting out these quotes to media, which I don't think helps his cause at all. Look, again, admirable for being transparent, but you're just adding fuel to the fire, mate. Honestly, I think he really needs to just go super minimum quiet, right? This is an opportunity for him to win a world title. Another one he might not get, right? Because who knows what's going to happen in 2026. And all the time, Oscar's keeping it chill, just doing his thing, not going mad, celebrating when he's winning, not getting mad on himself when he's having a bad time. It all just plays into Oscar's advantage in terms of that inter-battle teammate dynamic. But of course, you know, for Oscar to win this title, it's not only Lando he needs to worry about, is it? We know full well Max Verstappen will take any and all opportunities presented to him, don't we? But the machinery is holding him back at the moment. In Suzuka, he was able to perform because tyre degradation was not a problem, and that car inherently runs well around Japan, a more front-limited circuit. That Red Bull cooks, okay? In Bahrain, more rear-limited, big tyre deg. Red Bull was absolutely nowhere all weekend. He only just scraped P6 ahead of Pierre Gasly. That tells you all you need to know, right? When people talk about what the fastest car is, it can vary so much depending on the track. And we know Red Bull, I don't think in any guise is the quickest car. In Suzuka, it might have been second. I think it was second quickest car, especially obviously in the hands of Max. But in Bahrain, it was fourth, maybe even fifth. Maybe it was actually slower than the Alpine. But look, Max is the best driver in F1 and arguably the best of all time. I think we can absolutely say that now. Yet even he can't drive around, you know, this car being the fourth, fifth quickest and take that to race wins. Of course he can't, because the talent on the grid is far too strong for even someone as amazing as Max to be able to do that. And until Red Bull can bring some kind of a fix, because they're not very happy internally, understandably so, you know, that Imola upgrade is going to be important, and then the flexi-wing change round 9 in Barcelona is going to be just as, if not more, hard to say. It will definitely be worth kind of re-evaluating the lay of the land after Barcelona. Barcelona's more front limited as well, so that should work for Max. You know what? Max versus Oscar, because Oscar's not one to bite, because he doesn't have that personal relationship, I do back Oscar to handle Max better. I do. I think Max knows how to play the off-track game with Lando to put out these things about, oh, if I was in the McLaren, I'd be miles clear. And Lando bites and Oscar doesn't really, right? And I just think this whole cauldron of what it takes to be a top-tier race winner, Oscar's steely approach, Max is going to find it much more difficult to break that wall down. And whilst Max is currently being held back by the machinery underneath him, when we go to Jeddah this weekend and then Miami, I do back Oscar to maximise these opportunities and outscore Max big time and make Verstappen be the chaser, which, you know, I think Max thrives in that position. I back Oscar to defend that leading position against Max way more than Lando could. I do. Although there is another driver who certainly, and you look at the driver standings, definitely in the mix. He just needs a little bit more, doesn't he? Because Mercedes aren't quite giving George Russell the car, but I'll tell you what, in terms of drivers so far over these first 4 rounds, probably the most consistent, probably the most impressive driver so far this season is George Russell in a Mercedes that for a long time it's been the big Achilles heel is consistency, yet it's been super consistent so far this year in the chillier conditions, in the hotter conditions as well. Bahrain testing versus the race. The Mercedes was probably the second best car in testing in the cold, and it was the second best car in the heat of Bahrain. Like, George is cooking, and mentality wise, you know he's got it. One lap pace wise, you know he's got it. Mistakes, I feel like he's starting to dial them out now. You know, that's been his Achilles heel. Every driver has a weakness, right? And I think being a bit crash happy, he's not the first. Leclerc was very crash happy early on in his career. Max Verstappen was very crash happy early on in his career. And they've turned out all right. You can't write George Russell off for Mercedes. They do need to give him something just so that he can start winning races. Because I back George to consistently get podiums and always be there and always be a factor. But to go that next step and to be beating McLarens on pace and maybe beating Red Bulls once they fix the car, if they fix the car. That extra little step, George needs a bit more performance. And look, I'd love to throw Kimi Antonelli in here, but ultimately, Kimi's very, very raw, very, very quick. I think all the operational stuff that I talked about with Oscar that he's now got on top of, Kimi's going to need more time to get on top of that stuff, but absolutely in the future, Kimi's going to be right up there with George fighting for titles if Mercedes can give them both the car. Right now, George is absolutely their best bet, and you know, let Kimi cook, let him do his thing. He's got steadily better finishing positions so far this season. The qualifying head-to-head with George, he's averaging almost 4 tenths behind George so far this year. He's going to get that. George is an absolute demon. I mean, look at what he did to Lewis Hamilton over their time as teammates. Well, certainly last year as teammates at Mercedes. You know, very, very convincing over a lap. I back Kimi for the future, but George for the present. George is absolutely ready to do this. He is absolutely ready to be here, to get his elbows out. He's already done it with Max in the past. We already know there's a little bit there. And by the way, George and Max are absolutely built the same, right? They might be two very, very different personalities, but in terms of competitive beasts, I mean, when Max was grassing up Lando Norris for being out of his grid box, that was George Russell every day of the week. And George would be like super grass on that. That's what Max was doing to Lando, because they are both absolute competitors and they might have very, very different characters and personalities. If Mercedes bring an upgrade, Oscar needs to be worried about George Russell. He will absolutely be at the races, which is more than can be said for the team in red. Oh, what a shame, man. Ferrari just don't seem to quite have it, do they? They don't seem to quite have the pace. They bought a floor upgrade to Bahrain. Obviously, Charles Leclerc qualified P3, started P2 with the grid drop for George. They just don't quite have enough, do they? It's a real shame, because it really felt, you know, how they finished the end of last year. Ferrari were coming into this season with big momentum. They said they make loads of changes to the car as well. Was that a mistake? Maybe there's more performance this Ferrari car can unlock by like mid-season, but they need, like, this needs to happen by mid-season. Like, they can't let themselves get too far back, and they're already a mile off in the Drivers' Championship and the Constructors to boot as well. Leclerc feels like the stronger driver. Lewis, of course, had his moment in the China sprint race, but it does feel, all in all, that Leclerc is the Ferrari driver to spearhead a challenge if they can give them the car. And Lewis's negative self-talk does worry me as well. You know, Mercedes is one thing where that's a team you've been at for a very long time, and the new young upstarts come in and is out qualifying you very, very consistently. You're going to feel some anxiety and some kind of paranoia, right, that the team's holding information from you because it's your last year at the team, and that's all going to play into that. And again, just like Lando, Lewis is very transparent, but we've not seen Lewis be this vulnerable in the way he's spoken this weekend in Bahrain since, well, the end of last year. To be so on himself after 4 races. You know, you look at how Carlos Sainz has struggled in the Williams, but he's been very, very optimistic and very, no, future's here, boom, 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 we're going to get there. Maybe Lewis is a couple of tenths off of Charles, not 6 tenths like he was in Bahrain, right? He clearly messed up his lap, but maybe he's a couple of tenths off Charles Leclerc. But you can still win world titles, because Lewis Hamilton is unbelievable in race trim. When you're not pushing at 100%, when you're operating in that little margin and just managing a race, Lewis is one of the greatest to ever do it. And I would say right now, he is still one of the greatest to be able to execute a Grand Prix. Don't be so hard on yourself, man. That's what I'm surprised he's being this hard on himself. Either way, Charles is also showing that this car isn't quick enough to win Grand Prix yet. Hopefully yet is the important term there. Hopefully Fred and the technical team can find a way to bring a little bit more performance. 26 seems to be the play, of course. Lewis and Charles will definitely be in that team next year, and that's exciting to see. But I was really hoping that they give Ferrari a car. I didn't think Lewis would be able to deliver it. You know, I predicted Leclerc to win the title this year, because I felt like they'd carry that momentum, and Charles is unbelievable and he's so bedded into this team, and he has been the better driver of the two so far this year. Lewis at times has been closer than I thought it'd be, though, to be fair to Lewis. I don't think Oscar has to worry about the Ferraris too much, to be honest. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of Oscar Piastri. What do you think his weaknesses are still? And do you think we've seen enough Grand Prix, enough consistency so far from Oscar this year to be able to throw this kind of compliment towards him? Because I do really think this kid's generational. I really do. Drop a like if you enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you're new and you want to see more. My name's Tommo. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.